اليوم يولد من البتول الضابط الخليقة بأسرها بقبضته.
Assalamu alaikum wa al-MaseeHee. The ancient churches, whether they be Catholic, Orthodox, or Miaphysite, have long held that Christ was born on the 25th of December. Of course, such a date is not found in the Bible and even lacks attestation in our earliest patristic sources. As a result, it's quite popular today for people to deny that Jesus was born in December. In this video, I intend to examine some of the popular arguments against the December date, and while I won't prove definitively that Christ was born on December 25th, I will at least present an argument for why a late December birth is quite plausible. So to begin, I'd like to jump into the subject of the priestly courses. There are numerous people out there who claim that anyone who understands the priestly courses will know that Jesus could not possibly have been born in December. I've examined such many of these kind of arguments, and I've noticed that in every single case, the fatal flaw is that the polemicists don't provide a justification for where they begin the count. Some will simply assert that the courses began in the month of Abib, or Nisan, while others will say that they began in the month of Tishrei, but no justification is ever given, at least not in any of the polemics I've seen. The truth of the matter is that the courses are somewhat of a black box. No one seems to know if they continuously slid back against the calendar or if there were methods in place to keep them stable. There's lots of people making assertions this way or that, but none of them bring evidence from early sources. You just have to kind of take their word for it. So, in reality, when dealing with the priestly courses, we can only speak about what is possible, not what is definite. This here is the text from the Babylonian Talmūd, tractate Anīt 29a. Now, some might wonder how the Talmud can be relevant. The answer is that it's one of the rare ancient sources, to assign a date to a priestly course, and it was compiled by ancient Pharisees who would have been familiar with the priestly courses. The text I have highlighted here states that when the first temple was destroyed, it was on the 9th of the Hebrew month of Ab, during the priestly course of Jehoiarib. This will allow us to demonstrate the plausibility of a December birth for Christ. First, let me note that according to Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, Book 7, Section 14, Number 7, each priestly course ran for a week, beginning on one Sabbath and then ending on the next Sabbath when the next course took over. This allows us to know how far apart each course was. So now we can present our argument in 8 steps. Point 1. It is possible for the priestly course of Jehoiarib to fall around the 9th of Ab. Point 2. That means it is possible for the priestly course of Jehoiarib to fall in early August. For example, this year, the 9th of Ab fell on the 4th of August. August 4th. Point 3. Zechariah was in the temple during the priestly course of Abijah. See Luke 1:5. Point 4. The priestly course of Abijah fell 7 weeks after that of Jehoiarib. You can see 1 Chronicles chapter 24, verses 7 to 10 for this. Point 5. It is possible for Point 5. If it is possible for Jehoiarib to fall in early August, then it is possible for Abijah to fall in late September. For example, this year, 7 weeks after the 9th of Ab, which, as was just mentioned, fell on 4th August, would be the 22nd of September. Point 6. Luke gives the impression that Mary became pregnant 6 months after Zechariah's time in the temple. This is an easy conclusion from Luke chapter 1, verses 26 to 36. Point 7. This allows us to put Christ's birth 9 months later, which would be 15 months after Zechariah's time in the temple. And finally, we come to point 8. If it is possible for Zechariah to have been in the temple in late September of 1 year, then it logically follows that it is possible that Christ was born in late December of the following year. Now, admittedly, this argument does not prove definitively that Christ was born in late December, but it at least shows that it's quite plausible that he did in light of extant evidence. It also shows that, contrary to the claims of popular polemicists, the priestly courses do not preclude a late December birth for Christ. On the contrary, they show that it's quite possible. Now I'd like to turn to some of the arguments against the December date, aside from the priestly courses, that is. Perhaps the most popular one is that which notes that Luke 2:8 states that there were shepherds watching their flocks, and then claims that in Palestine, shepherds don't watch their flocks in the winter. The latter claim, about shepherds in the winter, is, as far as I can see, devoid of evidence. When you press those who make it, they treat it like some sort of dogma that cannot be questioned. Some might, at most, appeal to someone else who made the same claim in print without providing any evidence, so everyone's just passing the buck around. I think one preliminary objection is simply to invoke Genesis 31:40, which has Jacob recounting being consumed by cold and frost while watching flocks at night. As far as I'm concerned, that right there might put an end to the polemic. But let's go deeper. Here's a picture of a Palestinian shepherd tending to his flock in the snow in December. This right here might put an end to the silly polemic about shepherds in the winter. But it gets better. This picture was actually taken in December of 2013 after an unusually heavy snowstorm. Palestinian winters don't usually look like this, so let's show a more typical image of a Palestinian shepherd tending to a flock during late December. I'll provide a link to the source in the video description for this photo. It should be noted that the average low temperature for Bethlehem in December is 7 degrees Celsius, or 45 degrees Fahrenheit for those of us that are in the Americas. That's not exactly freezing temperatures, and frankly, shepherds would have access to skins and wool, so these are temperatures that they could handle fairly easily. Furthermore, the temperature on a typical day can be well above that average. For example, there have been times in Bethlehem where the temperature in December was as high as 29 degrees Celsius, or 83 degrees Fahrenheit, again, for those of us who are in the Americas. So the idea that every day in a Palestinian winter is too cold to watch sheep is simply absurd. At this point, proponents of the polemic might say, okay, Palestinian shepherds do tend to their flocks in the winter, but only in the daytime. Such people claim that Palestinian shepherds did not watch their flocks at night. Honestly, this claim too is baseless. This is from page 124 of the first volume of Charles William Wilson's Picturesque Palestine, Sinai, and Egypt. It was a 19th century guidebook on Palestine which recorded pasturage near Bethlehem during winter nights. So those actually familiar with Bethlehem know that there are shepherds who have their flocks out in the fields during winter nights. And now I'd like to turn to an article on FAO.org, the official website of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. I'll link to the article in the description of this video. It's authored by a professor of animal breeding at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. The article states at one point that, quote, in Iraq, the principal lambing season of Awasi ewes is in November, and in Lebanon, the Syrian Arab Republic, and Israel. Why is this relevant? Well, consider this line, which states, quote, during the lambing season, lambs born in the field and still too weak to follow their dams are carried by the shepherds to the tents or villages where they remain for a few days until strong enough to join their dams at pasture, end quote. Understand that. Lambing season in Palestine is in December and January, and lambs are born in the fields. This means that Palestinian shepherds are out in the fields with their flocks. But it gets better. The article also states that, quote, Bedouin and Fellahin shepherds know nothing of tent or house, but live entirely in the open together with the flocks under their care. They are working 365 days a year from 13 to 16 hours a day. Their work includes shepherding, watching at night, care of sick animals, training of bellwethers, shearing, weaning of lambs, etc., end quote. This means there are shepherds in the region who work 13 to 16-hour shifts all year round. There's only 10 or 11 hours of sunlight in Palestine during December, so this would entail even watching flocks at night during the winter. If that's not clear enough, this same text specifically states that their job includes watching flocks at night. To drive this point home with one final quote, the article also states that, quote, the flocks of the Bedouin and the majority of the Fellahin are kept in the open, day and night, throughout the year and depend entirely on natural grasslands, end quote. This means there is nothing implausible about the existence of shepherds in Palestine who have their sheep out to pasture on winter nights. So much for that polemic. And now I'd like to turn to the subject of quote-unquote paganism, whatever that means. There are many people out there who will note that popular folk accretions like the evergreen tree or the proximity and date to non-Christian celebrations like Saturnalia or the birth of Sol Invictus, and then declare that this is proof that Jesus was not born in December. Rather, they claim the date was just chosen to Christianize an already existing pagan holiday. Personally, I find this to be one of the weakest objections of all. Some of the claims associated with this polemic are very questionable. For example, a lot of people will claim that Nimrod's birth was celebrated on the 25th of December. I've asked all those who claim such to cite a source which records such a belief, and no ancient texts or inscriptions are furnished. In fact, in my own studies, I've yet to find a source earlier than the 19th century making that claim. But still, what about the folk accretions, like the Christmas tree and various other customs which obviously have non-Christian origins? I'd like to present an analogy for at least those viewers who believe in the Bible. I would propose that arguing that Jesus could not have been born in December because today people celebrate his birth with evergreen trees is like arguing that Jesus could not have risen in the spring because today people celebrate his resurrection with bunnies and eggs. What do I mean by this? Well, there are Christians who understand that Christ's resurrection happened in the spring, right after Passover, and that later on, people began to incorporate customs from non-Christian springtime festivals into celebrations of Christ's resurrection. This is why things like bunnies and eggs are now associated by some with Pascha or Easter. But this would mean that even if the celebration of an event now has non-Christian customs particular to the season, that does not mean the event being celebrated did not actually happen in that season. Once this point is understood, it undercuts the appeal to quote-unquote paganism. Just as springtime folk customs associated with celebrations of Christ's resurrection do not mean that Christ did not rise in the spring. Having said that, I would like to give a hypothetical thought experiment which can provide a plausible scenario in which Christ is born at the same time as when non-Christians would wind up celebrating things like the birth of Sol Invictus, the unconquerable sun. Note the following 3 points. Point 1. The sun is an analogy for Christ. You can see this in Malachi 4:2, which calls Christ the Son of Righteousness, and it might be argued that the sun in Revelation 12:1 is an allusion to Christ as well. Point 2. Christ was originally revealed to a people in the northern hemisphere, i.e. Israel, Palestine. Point 3. It was possible for even non-Jews to see allusions to Christ's coming in the heavens. You can see this in Matthew 2:2, where the Magians somehow were able, the Magi were somehow able to glean that Christ was born by reading it in the heavens. When you combine these 3 points, I'm left wondering, why would it necessarily be absurd if Christ was born slightly after the winter solstice of the northern hemisphere? In other words, if the sun can be used as a metaphor for Christ, and even so-called quote-unquote pagans could get some vague idea of the story of Christ by reading the heavens, then I see no reason why it is absurd for Christ to be born at precisely a time when the sun seems to be getting stronger from its weakest point. And if this was the case, why should we be alarmed if other cultures built mildly similar narratives around their vague reading of the signs in the heavens? In other words, the celebration of the birth of Sol Invictus in late December need not negate Christ being born around the same time. On the contrary, from this perspective, we could just as easily conclude, just as plausibly conclude, that if Christ was born in late December, so-called pagans could have gotten some vague idea of that from their own readings of the heavens, and then mix that vague understanding of the truth with their own imaginations and lies, and the result being the construction of these sorts of mild parallels. Before I close, I'd like to take a moment to discuss the Qur'an. Now, Christians may wonder what the point of this is, and I admit that as a Christian, I personally do not feel compelled to reconcile a belief that Christ was born in December with what the Qur'an states. Nonetheless, there is an argument made by some Muslims which holds that the Qur'an implies Christ could not have been born in the winter. This is of concern for me because there are other Muslims who are very warm and respectful around Christmas time. For example, the current president of Iran tweets Christmas felicitations around this time of year. Aside from that, al-Manar, the satellite channel affiliated with Hezbollah, often has Christmas coverage.
إعداداتها للاحتفال بميلاد السيد المسيح عليه السلام. أشجار الميلاد أضيئت وحركة المرور رتبت بانتظار زوار كنيسة المهد في بيت لحم لإحياء أعياد الميلاد المجيدة.
There also happen to be certain Muslims who do believe that Jesus was born in December. In fact, there's one sect, the Alawis, who celebrate Christmas. I know many Orthodox Muslims will be tempted to say that those minority sects aren't really Muslims, but me personally, I don't endorse such restrictions, and frankly, I'm not the only one.
ولما بحكي عن المسلمين بقصد السنة والدروز والشيعة والعلويين.
But I don't want to get into a fight about whether such people are Muslims or not. At the very least, we can say certain people, whether you consider them Muslim or not, profess belief in the Qur'an and celebrate Christ's birth in December. Because I have a certain affinity for those who are friendly around Christmas, and especially those who celebrate it, I want to explore this claim that the Qur'an allegedly contradicts a winter birth for Christ, and show that, on the contrary, it's possible for those Muslims who celebrate, or at least respect Christmas, to believe in both the Qur'an and a December birth for Christ. So let's explore the claim that these two beliefs contradict. Here I'd like to play a clip of Ahmed Deedat putting forth the basic argument.
The birthday of Jesus. The Quran tells us very, very clearly that when Jesus was born, his mother Mary was told, he says, shake the palm leaf, the leaf of the palm leaf, date palm, and it will let fall fresh ripe dates. Means the dates were ripe, ready. You just shake it and the thing will fall. And you can eat and refresh yourself with the rivulet, with the small river running by, refresh yourself. After the birth of the child, she's told that. So it was midsummer. If the Quran says that the dates were ripe, it means midsummer, not midwinter. Palestine is in the northern hemisphere. Your winter and their winter is the same. So you don't have winter in midsummer. Dates in midsummer. So it was midsummer.
For those who didn't catch it from the Arabic subtitles, Deedat was appealing to the 24th and 25th verses of Surah Maryam, the 19th chapter of the Qur'an. With that in mind, I'd like to turn to Tafsir al-Jalalain, a late 15th century Sunni commentary on the Qur'an. Regarding the tree in verse 25, these commentators state Kanat Yabisa, which means it was withered, it was dead, it was dry, it was crusty. This would mean that God brought it back to life for Mary. Regarding the little stream in verse 24, the same commentators say that it was a river which had previously been stopped or dried up. Now, at this point, some Muslims might object that they're under no obligation to side with the interpretations of as-Suyuti or al-MaseeHee, but that would miss the point. The relevant point to be gleaned is that fairly sober commentators understood the verses as referring to a miracle. Therefore, the text itself is not obviously making a statement about the season. It's at least possible that it was referring to conditions changed at the moment by God. So a believer in the Qur'an is not forced to believe Christ was not born in December. So, with that, I think in this video I've dealt a blow to the major objections to the belief that Christ was born in December, and I also believe that I've shown that the traditional date is plausible in light of extant evidence. I look forward to discussing this subject further with others in the comment section of this video or even in future videos, God willing. Until then, I'd like to wish everyone a very Merry Christmas.